So friends, I have a subject for today, which is spiritual guidance for living in toxic times. As you know, the spirituality I've been teaching, that we've been practicing, Sufism I've been teaching, is what I would call engaged spirituality. It is not a spirituality that involves isolation, that involves removing yourself from civilization, from humanity, or isolating yourself. We are engaged in humanity, we are engaged in life, outwardly to be with the people, inwardly to be with God. This has always been an important aspect of Sufism. Together with that, as we have been aspiring to make a contribution to humanity, to the earth at this present time. And yet something has changed that we need to take into account right now. Although it's been on the horizon for the last 10 years, it has changed in the last 6 months. And it's changed completely. So firstly, it is really important to recognize that something has changed in the outer world and also in the inner world. And because we work in the inner worlds, it affects our work, the path, in many foreseen and unforeseen ways. And that's what I want to try and explain to you. So how to live our light and make our contribution in an era that has become and will become increasingly toxic. Humanity has made a choice that isn't just backwards towards a certain isolationism, a certain turning away from oneness, from interconnectivity, from a global civilization, which should have been humanity's next step, which is the logical evolution of humanity, which I have been teaching for the last 20 years. This shift towards oneness, realizing our interconnectivity, both on the global human level, but also with the earth, our interconnectivity with the earth, the interdependence, that spiritual principle of oneness that is so essential to our practice, to our spiritual awareness, that was being offered to humanity in many forms of globalization, of interconnectivity. And humanity has made a choice, no, this is not the step in evolution they want to make. There is a regression, not just isolation, but actually humanity as a whole is starting to regress. And it means, for example, that spiritually certain things can't happen that could have happened. And it also affects our practice, because we are not practicing in isolation. Our practice is both part of the journey of humanity as a whole. We are part of humanity. We are involved in humanity, in the inner and the outer worlds, and also affects the earth itself. In fact, the 2 days after the election in America, I had an experience in which I was suddenly in the garden of our center in Inverness, and I was together with some very, very old Native American elders, and there was this sadness in them for the soul of America, what is beneath the surface, not just for the land, but for the soul of America. There is a tendency in a lot of spirituality to think everything is going to be okay, and yes, everything is loved and everything is full of the light of God, but at the same time, individually and collectively, humanity makes choices and goes forward or steps back, just as people can do that on the path and in their own life, in their own destiny. So this happened to humanity as a whole. We are now living in what has been called a post-truth era. A post-truth era. The truth no longer counts. Yes, we are always living in a world of illusion. This is a basic spiritual truth. This is the dance of Maya. This is the dance of illusion. But there were certain accepted norms in this dance of illusion, certain shared values, particularly in the West, that have been brushed aside. And we are now living in a different era in which the shared truth and the shared values that of a civilization we held no longer necessarily apply. And we don't know what that will mean. I mean, you never believe politicians anyway, that's a basic prerequisite, but there was a kind of a shared disbelief. And now that is gone. And we don't know what that means, except that it means everything becomes more toxic, both in the inner and the outer worlds. So it's not going to go back. This is not, otherwise I wouldn't talk about it. This is not something, oh, we'll get used to it, it's just the way things are. No, humanity was given globalization, particularly in the last 20 years. I'll give you a little example of it, which I went to buy some green beans in the supermarket the other day, and I always look to see where they've come from, and the green beans came from Kenya, so I thought, well, maybe I'll have something else, and I looked at some other vegetables, and that came from South America. And that's only been in the last 20 years, where you just go to the local supermarket. It comes from all over the world. This is globalization. And it was supposed to bring with it, just like the internet, it was supposed to bring with it this shared oneness. We're all part of one humanity. We're all part of one living, breathing earth. And it brought with it an awareness of global interconnectivity, of global interdependence, of one humanity, of one earth, and everything that means, which is a new way for humanity to live. And humanity has clearly said no, and it has gone back, whether it's gone back to some idealized image of the 50s, but when I was growing up in the 50s it wasn't so pleasant, but it was rather grey, but who knows? And this is the new reality, which is, say, it's not just isolationism. Isolationism is one thing, it is actually a regression. I actually wrote about this in Darkening of the Light, because, as you know, a number of years ago I was given a whole series of visions of the future. One of these visions I had, I just read it to give you a context. And so we wait in the darkness of a dying world. We sense in our souls what we can see in the ecosystem, that something is over, that the world will not return to what it was. And the collective, still caught in its dreams of materialism, feels an anxiety, even anger, as it knows that this dream has passed its sell-by date, that its promises of prosperity are empty. And what we have seen played out both in America and in England, but also in other parts of the world, is this anger, this unconscious collective anger breaking through. That this dream of material prosperity, of things always getting better, is over and nothing else is there, and it has created this anger that has then become a regression. If you get taken over by a certain anger, it pulls you down to a lower level of evolution. And this is something you know in your own individual life. You can see when anger comes up and it takes over, a certain resentment, it pulls you down to a lower place inside of you, and you often have to work to free yourself from it, to reconnect with your higher spiritual centers. And there's absolutely no indication that the collective has any interest in working with this anger this resentment, and so there is this regression. So that's the present situation. Although there have been indications of it, and that's the importance of this book, Darkening the Light, that's why I wrote it, to share these indications that this could happen, because you see in the inner world forces emerging in the inner world. What we've seen in the last 6 months is those being enacted collectively, and they are now part of the world in which we live. And it's not going to go back, it's not going to change. And we don't really know what will happen. But it's a choice humanity has made, and we have to live with it. We're moving into a time when forces within the collective are particularly toxic. And it's being played out in the outer world, and of course that means it's also being played out in the inner world. And we don't know what that means. The Taoists called it the red dust. And the red dust, the dust of the world, is becoming polluted, but it's becoming polluted with anger, with insecurity, and other forces from the depths of the collective psyche. We're like an iceberg, so we're a fifth, a third in this conscious world, but the vast majority of us, and particularly as we do spiritual practice, is present in the inner worlds, and there are many, many forces now being released in the inner worlds. It is obvious and apparent to see a certain anger getting played out, in all the different scenarios you can read about in the newspaper and all the ones you don't read about in the newspaper. And it's not happening over there. I would like to emphasize that to you. Part of the positive and negative effects of moving into this era of oneness, it means that we are all in the same space together. There is this fantasy of isolationism that's being played out on the political arena, but it is a complete fantasy because humanity has become globalized. And probably if you did very certain practices and you lived in a certain place, you might be able to isolate yourself from everything that's happening in the world. Like you used to do. You found a good cave, became a hermit halfway up a mountain, and you could isolate yourself inwardly and outwardly from everything happening in the world and just do your spiritual practice. I don't think you can anymore. So everything affects us inwardly and outwardly, and we have to learn to live with it, and it's getting increasingly toxic. There are different levels of toxicity. The reason I wrote this book, Darkening the Light, was because I was shown 10 years ago these forces beginning to constellate in the inner world and the effect they were beginning to have. And just the simple fact that we are now moving into a post-truth era is significant. Most of us in the past 20 years have lived with these toxic energies of consumerism. The buy. Tweedy once gave a talk about that, and she said, and this was before kind of mass consumerism, she said if you go into a department store at a sale time, you get caught in this energy and you end up buying things you didn't need to buy. And most of us are mature enough now that we've learned not to get caught in that. We don't buy things we don't need. We realize, we're mature enough, we realize the waste of energy that happens when you do that, how you get caught in certain thought forms and energy patterns that drain you materially, financially, but also spiritually. We're just mature enough or grown up enough that the glitz of stuff no longer attracts our attention. But now there are going to be present much more dangerous forces from the collective unconscious and psychic forces, energies that come with them. It was played out recently in the election in America when certain taboos were broken. Certain things were said publicly that weren't said publicly before. Certain courtesy was discarded. And there is a reason that one has taboos in a culture, because taboos stop primitive forces from the depths of the unconscious taking over. They're very simple. That's why, for example, there's a very strong taboo against incest, because it's a very powerful force, incest. And so culturally, one of the strongest taboos is against incest, because it is such a powerful force. Taboos are there, you see them very strongly in primitive cultures. This is taboo, this is taboo, this is taboo. In our culture, they're not named as taboos, but there's a certain courtesy. I'm sure many of you have read Lord of the Flies, in which this group of kids are in a situation where all the taboos are broken. And all of the forces from the collective unconscious then get played out. This just is an example of what has begun to get played out. It's like if there is no longer any accepted truth, we have no idea what it means. One thing is what it means in the conscious world, but what it means in the inner worlds, chaos factor, we don't know. We don't know what comes up from the depths of the unconscious. One thing was very, very apparent in the recent election in America. There wasn't any kindness there. It was full of aggression. It was full of who's right and who's wrong and who's this and who's that. And there was a lack of just kindness. We're just people. That's why I go back to the Native Americans, and they have this, what they call the original instructions, which in their tradition was given by the gods to humanity. The original instructions about being in this earth. And the original instructions, in one interpretation, is we just have to get along together. Get along together with all of creation, with all of... Emmanuel recently made a little film of these nuns working with the Karmapa in India, and they have this phrase, compassion is action. Compassion is action. Whether you get along with all of creation, being kind. We're all part of one living whole. Again, it's not complicated, it's actually very simple. And we're here to get along together. That's how the world is actually made. It's this. Doesn't mean that lions can't kill animals, or doesn't mean you always have a good day. But it's a basic principle. In a way, as Sufi communities, it should be a nucleus of that. We're here to help each other, to get along, to be kind, to be supportive, to help where it's need to be helped. Not because it's spiritual or good, because it should be a natural way to be. But just here to help. And when somebody needs help, people gather around and help. Those values are always important, because those are the original instructions. But once you become aware we're living in a culture that's forgotten those original instructions, that no longer has that nobility of character at its core, and that is being infused with a certain negative energy that wants to bring humanity down, to take it to a lower level. If you look at this outer scene, it's not just has to do with a certain isolationism that is turning away from oneness. Yes, that is one aspect. But what is much more dangerous and much darker is a certain regression that is regressing to a certain baser instinct rather than a noble character. You can get drawn into that regression, into the me, it's just a lower level of evolution. And we have to hold a certain light that belongs to what is nobler in a human being, what is more beautiful in a human being, what is more radiant in a human being. And it's just very simple things. And also, again, if you live like that, from a spiritual point of view, you create around you an energy field that protects you and protects the community and becomes more infused with the light of God, rather than a certain darkness that has a certain elemental energy in it that we don't understand as a culture. And part of my concern is that we've entered into a psychic minefield without knowing that we're going there. So it needs a certain awareness. But as I say, it doesn't mean you can't enjoy life, you can't have a nice meal with friends, you can't see the beauty, see the love in everything. But it does mean one needs a particular awareness, and one makes sure one's own individual light is not influenced or diminished by this gathering darkness, by this. So you live from this place of a deeper understanding. The world goes on its course. Yes, it's going through a bad hiccup. Maybe in 20 years or 200 years it will have realigned itself. And at the same time, there is a deeper mystery taking place, which has to do with the mystery of love, to do with the mystery of the soul of creation, the soul of the world. And hopefully our soul can be part of that mystery. As the I Ching says, one should let many things pass without being duped. I think that is excellent advice. One should let many things pass. This is a time not to get caught up. One always avoids being caught up, but this is a time particularly because it's all a lie anyway. Time to let many things pass, but at the same time you are not duped. Once you realize we're in a post-truth era, then let it all pass, but don't get duped by it. Don't get caught up in the lies. And if possible, both individually and also as a community, we take part in this greater mystery, which has to do with this, the spiritual nature of creation, the spiritual nature of the world, the spiritual nature of the cosmos. And that is very beautiful, and it is in a way quite different to what is being played out on this worldly stage at the moment. The world is going through a very peculiar, even the great ones, they were a little surprised. They said, gosh, humanity is doing that? But in the midst of it, there is something very beautiful taking place, which we can participate in, which has to do with the vision I had for many, many years, which is this child with stars in its eyes, this other level of consciousness, which is very, very, very beautiful, and which belongs to a much greater dimension. And to bring a little bit of light, please, in this, I call this darkening, to bring a little bit of light into this darkening, both through remembrance of God, through loving kindness and compassion, and through living from a certain inner nobility, regardless of what happens around you. I think that's all one can do.
I've been wondering about this for a while now. It seems like we're thrown back into regression, and
we are not thrown back.
No, but
we are not thrown back. Humanity has taken a step backwards. We belong to God. We belong to the Creator, not to the creation.
Okay. Do we, until a proper unity can and oneness can happen, do we have to wait until the last straggler comes on board?
Nope. I actually wrote about this in this chapter in here. Many years ago, I came out of meditation with a sentence that really shocked me, which is, those who follow the light, those who follow the darkness, stay here. And which really shocked me because I always believed completely in oneness, and it made a clear distinction that there is going to be a separation of the ways. There is kind of an evolutionary split between those who are working with the light and those who are caught in the density of this world. How that will play out over the next 100 years or so, I am not quite sure. I've seen a little bit into the future, but humanity is always full of surprises. There is this evolutionary shift into oneness, global oneness. It is not going back. It's already here. Unless something happens on the apocalyptic level, that there is no more internet, no more global transportation, and everybody goes back into not just a psychological tribal mentality, but into a physical tribal reality. As much as there is this isolationism, this regression being played out, since the turn of the millennia, we are in a global era. And there are those who are working with that not in a get-rich-quick mentality, which has actually created more division. I don't know if you read recently, the top 8 richest people in the world now own as much as the rest of the half of the world. 8 people own as much as 3.6 billion people. That is the result of one aspect of globalization. It's actually created more division, it's created more exploitation, it's created more devastation. That's why I was so moved by Pope Francis when he talked about the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Globalization has actually created more exploitation and more poverty. There is a network of people who are working ethically with that awakening oneness in small groups in different parts of the world, and we are one of them. And this is very, very important, and one holds true to that principle. It is a central part of our practice and our awareness, the awareness of oneness, that we live from that place. It does help something in the inner worlds or in another dimension to come into existence in the inner worlds, to be born some different level of consciousness for the earth. It may not be reflected into humanity. For centuries, there was the possibility for humanity as a whole to be part of that spiritual awakening, which I call awakening into oneness, or many people call unity consciousness, global consciousness. There was a possibility, maybe just a slim possibility, for humanity as a whole to wake up to what that would mean. And for example, when I was given all those visions, I was shown that there are technologies waiting on the inner planes. For example, completely free solar energy that is completely non-polluting. It's not complicated. All the technology is there waiting to be given to humanity. But if humanity can only receive it if they are in a state of oneness, because it's technology that belongs to oneness. And there is a whole series of technologies. They're already designed. They don't have to be invented. They're designed. How light works. There are many forms of healing that belong to humanity, that could belong to humanity's next step in evolution. Healing with sound, healing with light, healing with... It's not complicated, it's just different. It belongs to a different level of consciousness. But humanity can't receive it in its present ego-centered collective consciousness. So maybe in 100 years' time, maybe in 200 years' time, we don't know. But at the same time, that doesn't stop this spiritual consciousness from evolving in its own dimension. Just as, and this is important that you realize, what I've said to you is that whatever the toxicity in the outer world, It does not have to limit your spiritual evolution, the evolution of your soul and where it will go and what that means. It just is more and more difficult for it to be played out in this outer world. There is still, we don't know, because we haven't been there, what will happen in the next 20, 50 years. There is a network of people working towards a certain spiritual global consciousness. Whether that network will still be held, or whether it'll have to become more hidden, I don't know. And the work we're doing in the field of spiritual ecology is related to that. There are these two streams. Once you've seen the interdependence of life, once you've seen the interconnection of life, once you've seen that oneness, you can't not see it. But what was offered to humanity at a particular time, the greed, the desire, for money, for power, took over. And that will now have to get played out. And it is regressing, so it goes back to a lower level.
I just would like to be around long enough to see it.
I thought I would be. Now I think even my son thinks he probably won't be. Maybe my granddaughter will. Okay. It's not going to be in our lifetime now. No, that possibility is over. That curtain has been drawn. No.
Okay, that's what I was afraid of. But
yeah, no. Unless the masters, for example, are allowed to really intervene, and until now they haven't been. You never can tell. The grace of God is infinite, but humanity's been given free will. I had hoped to be alive when the world came alive again. I had really hoped, because I remember what it was like when the names of creation sang in the wind. It was so beautiful. It was, oh my gosh. It was magical. Everything was alive. Everything was singing its true purpose. And humanity and all the different inner and outer worlds were in harmony. And it was beautiful. Oh. But that time's long past. And it could have come again, yes, but not for now. I had the misfortune to see what it could be like. But it doesn't mean we can't keep that consciousness alive for future generations.
From The Mother's Agenda, February 1958. I came to the conclusion that from a practical standpoint, the solution is that the part of humanity expressing this error in its life and in its consciousness should, or to put it in another way, that part of humanity, of the human consciousness, capable of uniting with the supermind and of liberating itself, will be completely transformed. This humanity is moving towards a future reality not yet expressed in its outer form. Whereas the part of humanity nearer to the simplicity of the animal or of nature will be reabsorbed by nature and entirely re-assimilated. The possibility of a mental consciousness that allows for perversion, that makes mental perversion such an excruciating thing, will be abolished. It will disappear. These things will no longer be. The Mother's Agenda, June 1958. One thing seems clear. Humanity has reached such a generalized state of tension. Tension in effort, tension in action, tension even in daily life, with such an excessive hyperactivity, such an overall restlessness, that the species as a whole seems to have reached a point where it must either burst through the resistance and surge forth into a new consciousness, or else sink back into an abysm of obscurity and inertia. This tension is so total and so generalized that obviously something must break. It cannot go on like this. Yet all this is a sure sign that a new principle of force, consciousness and power has been infused into matter, and by its very pressure has produced this acute state. Outwardly, we might expect to see the old habitual means used by nature whenever she wants to bring about an upheaval. But here there is a new phenomenon, which is evidently visible only in a selected few, although even these few are widespread enough. This phenomenon is not localized in one point or one place in the world, for the signs are to be found in every country, all over the earth. The will to find a new, a higher, an ascending solution, an effort to surge forth into a vaster, more encompassing perfection. Certain ideas of a more general, more extensive, more collective nature, as it were, are being worked out and are at work in the world. And the two go together: a greater and more total possibility of destruction, and an inventiveness that unrestrainedly increases the possibility of catastrophe, a catastrophe that would be much more massive than it has ever been, and at the same time the birth, or rather the manifestation, of much higher and much more comprehensive ideas and wills which, when heard, will bring a vaster, more extensive, more complete and more perfect solution than before. This struggle, this conflict between the constructive forces of an ascending evolution, of an increasingly perfect and divine realization, and the more and more destructive forces, powerfully destructive, forces of an uncontrollable madness, is becoming more obvious, unmistakably visible, and it is a kind of race or battle as to which will be first to reach its goal. All the hostile, anti-divine forces, these forces of the vital world, seem to have descended upon earth and are using it as their field of action. And at the same time, a new, higher, more powerful spiritual force has also descended upon earth to bring a new life to it. This renders the battle more bitter, violent, and visible, but apparently more decisive too, which is why we may hope to arrive at an early solution. There was a time, not so very long ago, when man's spiritual aspiration was turned towards a silent, inactive peace, detached from all the things of this world, an evasion of life to avoid the struggle, precisely to rise above the battle, to be liberated from effort. It was a spiritual peace where, along with the cessation of tension, struggle, and effort, suffering in all its forms also ceased, and this was considered the true and unique expression of the spiritual and divine life. This is what was considered divine grace, divine succor, divine intervention. And even now, in this age of anguish, tension, and hypertension, this sovereign peace is of all help the best received, the most welcome, the relief asked and hoped for. For many, it is still the true sign of divine intervention, of divine grace. In fact, no matter what you wish to realize, you must begin by establishing this perfect and immutable peace, It is the necessary basis for any work. But unless you are thinking of an exclusive or personal and egoistic liberation, you cannot stop there. There is yet another aspect to the divine grace, the aspect of progress that will be victorious over all obstacles, the aspect that will propel humanity into a new realization, open the doors unto a new world, enable not only a select few to benefit from the divine realization, but through their influence, their example and their power, bring a new, better condition to the rest of humanity. It opens vistas of realization into the future and already foreseen possibilities through which an entire section of humanity, which is consciously or unconsciously open to the new forces, will be lifted up, as it were, towards a higher, more harmonious, more perfect life. And even individual transformations are not permissible nor possible in all cases. At least there will be a kind of uplifting of the whole, a harmonization of everything, enabling a new order, a new harmony to be established, and the anguish of disorder and the present strife to disappear and be replaced by an order that will allow for the harmonious working of the whole. There will be other consequences that by opposite means will tend to eradicate the perversion and ugliness created in life due to the intervention of the mind. A whole range of deformations that have aggravated suffering, misery, moral poverty, a whole zone of sordid and repugnant miseries that makes an entire portion of human life so hideous. That must disappear. That is what in many respects makes humanity infinitely inferior to animal life, with its simplicity and its natural spontaneity, and which in spite of everything is harmonious. Suffering among animals is never as miserable and sordid as it is in a whole section of humanity perverted by a mentality exclusively turned towards egoistic needs. One must rise above, surge forth into the light and the harmony, or sink back down into the simplicity of a wholesome, unperverted animal life. After a moment of silence, Mother adds, "But those who cannot be lifted up, who refuse to progress, will automatically lose the use of the mental consciousness and fall back into an infrahuman stage. I will tell you of an experience I had which will help you better understand. It was a short while after the supramental experience of the 3rd of February, and I was still in that state where things of the physical world seemed so remote, so absurd. A group of visitors asked permission to greet me, and they came one evening to the playground. They were rich people, that is, they had more money than they need to live. Among them was a woman in a sari. She was very fat, and her sari was so arranged as to hide her body. When she bent over to receive my blessings, a corner of her sari fell open, uncovering part of her body, a bare belly. An enormous belly. It came as a shock to me. There are obese people who are not at all repugnant, but there I suddenly saw the perversion, the rottenness that this abdomen concealed. It was like an enormous abscess expressing greed, vice, depravity of taste, sordid desire that seeks satisfaction as no animal would, grossly and above all perversely. I saw the perversion of a depraved mind placed at the service of the basest appetites. Then, in a flash, something leaped forth from me, a prayer, like a Veda. O Lord, it is this that must vanish. One can well understand that physical misery, or the unequal distribution of the world's wealth, could be remedied. One can think of economic and social solutions that could remedy all that, but this particular misery, this mental misery, this vital perversion, it is this that cannot change, that does not want to change. And those who belong to this kind of humanity are condemned in advance to disintegration. The meaning of original sin is precisely this: the perversion that began with the mind. That part of humanity, of the human consciousness, which is able to unite with the supermind and liberate itself, will be completely transformed. It is moving towards its future reality, as yet unexpressed in the outer form. The part very close to the simplicity of the animal, close to nature, will be reabsorbed by nature and thoroughly reassimilated. But that corrupted part of the human consciousness, which through its wrong use of the mind allows this perversion, will be abolished. That kind of humanity belongs to an unfruitful attempt and will be eliminated, like so many other abortive species which have vanished in the course of universal history. Certain prophets in the past had this apocalyptic vision, but as usual things became mixed, and along with their vision of the apocalypse, they did not have the vision of the supramental world that will come to uplift the consenting part of humanity and transform this physical world. However, to give hope to those born into this perverted part of the human consciousness, redemption through faith was taught. Those who have faith in the sacrifice of the divine in matter will automatically be saved in another world. Faith alone, without understanding, without intelligence. They never saw the supramental world, nor did they see that the great sacrifice of the divine in matter is that of an involution which will lead to the total revelation of the divine in matter itself.